Right, so the end of part 2 shows Robbie retreating further with the men to Dunkirk Beach, and we get him getting even more confused, and remember that in reality is how he ends up dying. He gets septicemia and it kills him. We're told on page 246, about a third of the way down, some everyday principle of continuity, the humdrum element that told him where he was in his own story faded from his use. Now remember, the style of part 2 is very different. It follows a stream of consciousness style. It follows Robbie's mind. And there's that idea here that Robbie is losing basically his sense of reality, and the story is doing exactly the same thing. The story has lost its grasp of clear characters and clear plot. So what's happening in the story echoes Robbie's development, both his loss of innocence, but also his growing confusion. We're told on page 248, about a quarter of the way down, from this distance they looked as placid as cattle, describing the men waiting on the beach. They're like cows. It shows that they're passive and it shows that they're placid as it's described. But I think also there's that foreshadowing of real violence to them, isn't there? Okay, you transport cattle usually to have them slaughtered. And there's that idea here, I think, that the men are just sort of waiting almost to be killed. And that's juxtaposed throughout, this idea of impending violence, with real images of innocence. Bottom of 248, we're told that they're in a circular park with a bandstand and a merry-go-round. Images of extreme innocence alongside this extreme violence. That's carried on page 249. There's a solitary sunbather in his underpants, about 5 lines down, face down on a towel, who's got patches of uneven sunburn, pink and white like a strawberry and vanilla ice cream. So there's a man sunbathing, it's compared to a pink and white ice cream, like the pink and white marshmallows from earlier in part 2. Again, it's childhood and it's innocence alongside this impending violence. We're told at the top of page 250 there was no electricity, only natural light, which was stained brown as though by absent beer. So we get the idea of staining, the idea of tainting, the idea of Robbie's tainted innocence there. The light is stained brown. Compare that to the white light at the end of part 1. But also I think there's the idea that it's almost like a sepia film. If you've seen old movies, they often are a bit brown because they're filmed in sepia. And there's the idea of Bryony almost looking back on this as a memory, almost like it's an old movie. So it's also tainted and stained because it's her view of it. The idea of tainted and staining and lost innocence continues on page 251, where they attack an RAF man. Okay, he's blamed basically because he's separate to the men. He's blamed for the failings of the RAF. And we're told he had no answers to their questions about 3 lines down, and he made no attempt to deny his responsibility. Basically, he becomes a scapegoat. Exactly the same way as Robbie was a scapegoat because of his class in part 1. Here, the man is a scapegoat because he's in the RAF. And you might think Robbie defended him, but he's a bit unsure what to do. We're told halfway down the page, or just over halfway down, any remaining sense of individual responsibility swelled away. When they're in the crowd, the men get the feeling that they're all sort of guilty and nobody's guilty. We get that idea it's not as simple as guilty and innocence. Everybody's guilty because they're all sort of involved, but then who's going to land the first punch? And we get that idea that things have really changed from part 1. That actually it's not as simple as this world of black and white and innocent and guilty as we got earlier on. We're told at the bottom of 251 that Robbie doesn't know what to do. Joining in would be better than nothing. Unpleasantly excited, he's strained forward. So we've got that real loss of innocence of Robbie there, haven't we? Okay, he is sort of scapegoating in the same way that he has been scapegoated himself. Unpleasantly excited. There's that idea that there's no real guilt here. Okay, you can take action and be safe. And then we're told when the man does get attacked, about a third of the way down page 252, there's some uneven applause, as though for a decent catch in the slips on the village green. So it's shocking violence, it's uncertain what's going to happen next, but it's compared to a cricket game, compared to a real sense of innocence, okay, and a real sense of, British sort of history. Top of page 255, we're told that Turner is feeling a familiar unreality taking hold. I think that's really important. Partly because he's called Turner, not Robbie. We're distant from him, know him by surname. The familiar unreality is because he's got septicemia, but it's also because this is Bryony taking over. This is Bryony's story, and we get her, as this part carries on, imposing order. But we also get the feeling that it's not real. Okay, that it's Bryony trying to put things right, trying to impose right and wrong and innocent and guilty. But we know it doesn't work because we've just seen the man being attacked. We're told, for example, on page 259, Robbie has this vision of a hotel room with a Persian rug. And we're told about 5 lines down, the more he described, the more certain he was that the room was close by. Again, we know that that's because of his madness, but there's also that sense that that's very like Bryony, isn't it? That language makes these things possible, makes these things happen. We told on page 261, about 3/4 of the way down, Bryony would change her evidence, she would rewrite the past so that the guilty became the innocent. But then, crucially, but what was guilt these days? It was cheap. Everyone was guilty and no one was. We know that guilt doesn't really exist as a concept because of what's just happened to that man. We're in the middle of a war. Everybody's lost their innocence. Nobody's innocent. But then nobody's really guilty either. So there's that idea that we know what Bryony intends to do, but we also know that actually it probably isn't going to work. We told on 262, about 1/3 of the way down, that Robbie's got invisible baggage. And he basically has this vision of seeing the twins and carrying them, and they're like this baggage over him. Again, it's his lost innocence, isn't it? That's, you know, from the time before the war, before the accusation. And that's linked to the leg in the tree, okay? Carrying the boys, like rescuing the boy in the tree. So we've got that real image again of destroyed innocence. What was the boys and saving them is now just this disembodied leg in a tree. We're told on the very bottom of 262, let the guilty bury the innocent and let no one change the evidence. Ironic, I think, for two ways. Partly because Robbie literally does get buried, he dies. But also the evidence good does get buried, doesn't it? The marshals stop anything coming to light. And there's that idea again that although we get the sense that order will prevail and Bryony will change the evidence, it's not really going to work. The world is different now because of the war, because of Robbie's loss of innocence. We get the sense in page 264 as he's told that he will be rescued, about 1/3 of the way down, squaring off to the right. Order would prevail. Okay, yeah, Robbie's innocent, he's going to be rescued because we need order. That's Bryony, isn't it? That's Bryony trying to impose this order that she wants, because in the story you should have a happy ending. So we get the sense that things have been put right, but we get the sense that that's not real. That in this world where an RAF man can be attacked by a lynch mob, the simple concepts like innocence and guilt don't work. Just after that, about 2/3 of the way down the page, Robbie's thinking about "I'll wait for you" from Cecilia. He knows that Cecilia's going to wait because he remembers the word, "Only you, come back." But remember, come back was also spoken to Bryony. And there's that sense here that Robbie's innocence and Robbie's belief in Cecilia is Bryony trying to impose order, trying to put things right. We're told that Robbie's thinking of Cecilia about 5 lines from the end. He thinks of her as whiter than the mist. Okay, it's lost innocence, it's white, but there's also the idea of death isn't the whiter than mist. We get the white at the end of part 1. So again, it's the idea that Bryony's trying to impose that innocence, trying to put things right, but they can't ever be put right. On the top of page 265, about 4 lines down, we're told, "Come back, she meant it, time would show she really meant it." And that's the clearest indicator, I think, of Bryony getting involved in this story here, isn't it? How do we know that time would show she really meant it? Well, because Bryony knows that she really meant it, because Bryony's looking back after the event, which is why right at the end, we're told, "Wait me before 7, I promise you won't hear another word from me." When we're reading part 2 initially, it feels like that's because things are put right. Robbie is sorted, Robbie is resolved, he doesn't have that baggage anymore. But what we turn out and find out at the end is because he dies. Okay, we don't hear another word, it's ironic because Robbie dies. And throughout the last couple of pages, you've got the sense that Robbie's influence is waning here and Bryony's taking over, and Bryony's adding order because Bryony feels guilty and Bryony wants to redeem the innocence and put the childhood back. But ironically, the style, the modernist style, the war, all show that she can't. This is a different world now. That's the end of part 2.